Okay, the final item of business this evening is a members' business debate on motion 18624 in the name of Paul Sweeney on dying in poverty at the end of life in Scotland 2025. The debate will be concluded without any questions being put. I'd invite members wishing to participate to press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Paul Sweeney. Up to 7 minutes, Mr Sweeney.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I'd like to thank everybody in the Chamber who supported this motion for members' business this evening. I think it is good and proper that on the week that saw the start of Stage 2 proceedings on your bill, Deputy Presiding Officer, Assisted Dying for Terminal Adult Scotland bill, that this Chamber takes a moment to consider end-of-life poverty in Scotland. Regardless of members' views on the bill before us in the Stage 2 proceedings, one thing has been made clear from the discussions in this Parliament and across the country, that we are all united by a massive majority in wanting the best possible support for those suffering with terminal illness. Dignity in those final months and days when suffering from a terminal illness should be a paramount consideration for this Parliament, so that no one need die in poverty, spending their final moments worrying about bills and how to afford their final meal and the implications for their loved ones. Unfortunately, as the preliminary data from Marie Curie's Dying in Poverty in Scotland 2025 report shows, dying in poverty is still the norm in too much of Scotland today. We want to believe that we live in a land where everyone dies in the comfort of their own bed, surrounded by family and friends in a peaceful, dignified and pain-free way. Yet a staggering 1 in 4 working-age people and 1 in 6 pensioners with a terminal illness die in end-of-life poverty every year in this country. I think we can all agree that that is completely unacceptable, Deputy Presiding Officer. Yet because Scotland remains such an unequal society in so many ways, most notably in terms of income, a closer look at the figures shows that it's areas like my own home city of Glasgow which are affected the most, with 1 in 3 working-age people dying in end-of-life poverty. A legacy of deindustrialisation, austerity and social neglect has led to too many of my constituents spending their whole lives from cradle to grave in poverty. Indeed, it's a life sentence before they're even born. Where there should be dignity and support, instead it is a constant, exhausting, overwhelming battle that doesn't end until their untimely passing. And as we saw just in the last couple of weeks, the news about the credit unions' funeral plans being pulled at a moment's notice by a completely unscrupulous provider shows that even in death, they are stripped of the dignity of a funeral that maybe was one they had planned. The fear of the pauper's funeral still looms large in this country. That final indignity stripped from elderly, low-income Scots with no recourse. I hope we can at least change that. This terrible overlap of class and health inequalities was brought home to me, and I've mentioned this before, when I visited the Marie Curie Hospice at Stobhill, where I was born, and met a lady there who was suffering from terminal throat cancer. She'd grown up in Bridgeton. She was actually had a difficult upbringing. She'd been involved in drug taking and various other things. She had 2 young boys, and she'd just got her life back on track, or so she thought. And she had this persistent cough and a sore throat. She went to the doctors umpteen times trying to get help. She was just sent away with painkillers, told it was just an infection. By the time she got a referral and was diagnosed, she had incurable throat cancer. She was in her late 40s. And having, walking around the hospice as you do as a member of Scottish Parliament, going in to visit places, suddenly to be confronted by this most horrendous story, shattering. What do you even say to someone in that situation? She felt she'd been robbed of her life because she wasn't taken seriously because of her upbringing, her ability to advocate. And she was then suffering a terminal illness, and she was going to die. What was the implications for her? What about her young kids? It was a really difficult conversation, and to try and turn it into something positive, talking about the impact she'd had on her children, how they were doing really well, trying to at least to gather some degree of positivity out of the situation. But she made a point that maybe if she had grown up in Bearsden rather than Bridgeton, she'd still be alive today. And I got a call just the day afterwards to say she'd actually passed away. So I think in many ways we need to think about the reality of the avoidable death that happens every day in Scotland because of this economic and social problem, and the lack of equality has to give way.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful to Paul Sweeney for taking the intervention and indeed his incredibly powerful speech tonight. And doesn't it speak to the disparity between what we believe the social contract that exists between us all here in Scotland and each other, and the reality that so many constituents face in that disparity? And actually, to compliment Marie Curie on the very, very powerful report, this should be an opportunity to relook at that and recommit to a full social contract that reaches out to people, the woman of whom he has most powerfully spoken.
Paul Sweeney.
Thank my friend for that point, and I couldn't agree more. And for all the immense work that the hospices do and their National Health Service does, there are too many people who simply are stripped of dignity at the end of their lives. And even just the ability to die at home rather than in a horrible clinical setting in a hospital is something that is robbed of too many people. This does not have to be the world we live in. Marie Curie have a number of recommendations in the report that would help us all alleviate poverty and dying and take the burdens off those in their end-of-life journey. One way would be for the Scottish Government and local authorities to work together to exempt terminally ill people from council tax, similar to the Manchester Discretionary Council Tax Support Scheme. This would lift the financial burden for those close to death and be a small step in creating a state that cares actively for those who are dying and actively recognises the struggles that they are going through and trying to minimise the stress of an already impossible situation to come to terms with. I realise that I've only touched on the initial findings of this fine report, and I'm sure that colleagues from across the Chamber will want to highlight the other important findings that it contains in the course of this evening's debate. But I think it is important to stress that we in this Chamber have the power to end the scourge of end-of-life poverty. It could be a family member, it could be a friend of ours, it could be us, who knows. We can build a social security system that is once again truly a cradle-to-grave system of protection. For if we don't, then the consequences will be that large numbers of our fellow Scots continue to suffer the humiliation and indignity of suffering at the end of life. I'd like to thank Marie Curie and Loughborough University for releasing the preliminary findings ahead of the full publication of the report, Dying in Poverty 2025, so that we were able to have this debate this evening. And I look forward to hearing contributions from across the Chamber, showing a united resolve to end end-of-life poverty in Scotland once and for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Sweeney. We move to the open debate. I call first Bob Doris to be followed by Alexander Stewart. Around 4 minutes. Mr Doris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I thank Paul Sweeney for bringing this to the Chamber this evening. I think it's important that we do discuss the preliminary findings of the Dying in Poverty in Scotland 2025 report by Marie Curie. And it's another significant contribution from Marie Curie in raising awareness and the lived experience of the issues for those approaching end of life. I would name-check Dying in the Margins report not that long ago, and a series of really immense contributions that they have made. But I have to say, as the Chair of the Cross-Party Group for Palliative Care and as Deputy Commissioner of the Social Justice Committee, I absolutely see this report as being vital in driving forward some of the work that I would like to do in this place.
Paul Sweeney.
Sorry, I'd like to thank Mr Dodge for referencing the Dying in the Margins report. I think it's really important because too often the dead can't advocate, and the power of that study, that exhibition, diarising people in the end of their lives, stories that might otherwise have been completely lost, was incredible. Because people are just coming to terms with the grief of losing their relative, not necessarily going to turn and actually advocate for them. So I think that was a really powerful point to make.
Bob Doris, I can give you the time back.
Thank you, and I'm pleased that Mr Sweeney put that on the record. I agree. But the most powerful thing, actually, in this preliminary report is there are suggested solutions or recommendations to change things, rather than talk about them as they are right now. So when we see that 1 in 4 people of working age approaching end of life are in poverty, but it's 1 in 6 pensioners, still too high, of course. The recommendation that the state pension level for those of working age should be accessible to everyone of working age at the point they have that terminal diagnosis. There's a powerful recommendation we come together to look at. They've identified, understandably, the impact on families where a family member has a terminal illness, often pushed below the poverty line because of childcare issues, housing issues, energy costs, that more needs to be done. So the Scottish Government should be maximising the uptake of disability and childcare benefits as quickly and speedily as possible. And I have to say, if the Scottish Child Payment was a standalone benefit rather than attached to universal credit, we could perhaps be more flexible how we deploy that for families where there's someone with a terminal illness. Another thing that we could absolutely do. And of course, to say we should fast-track benefits more than we do already for those living with disabilities where there's a terminal condition. Also, I could talk about sharing innovation and possible best practice. And I'd also like to name-check the Manchester experience, where they've identified that making council tax zero-rated for whether someone in the House with a terminal illness is certainly worth considering here in Scotland. It would be easy, there will be financial challenges, but if they can do it in Manchester, let's look to see what we can do across Scotland's local authorities. With 1 in 5 people who have a terminal condition living in fuel poverty, we need to look at energy costs. And the suggestion from Marie Curie is that, well, given that people living with a terminal condition are home more, they rely on medical devices more, and they're already in poverty, that a social tariff across the UK of at least a 50% discount on energy costs could be applied. That would take a political will in the UK Parliament and here in Scotland to deliver that. But together we could do it. I'll make maybe 1 or 2 other observations, because Marie Curie spell out, this is important to be the chair of the cross-party group in palliative care, that in the last year of our life, for someone living with a terminal condition, we spend £2.3 billion investing in them. Only £500 million is on social security. £1.1 billion is for care in hospital, with 59% of that being unplanned visits to accident and emergency. The leftovers, only 14%, is for community care. So hardly surprising then, one of the main things we can do for those living with a terminal illness is make that last year of their life as dignified, pain-free and out with poverty as possible. And that takes a whole systems approach. It's just not about the money in their pockets. Finally, Convener, Presiding Officer, I have a tiny bit of time. There has been some action in Scotland in terms of that social contract, and we do need to go further. So, for example, folk approaching the end of life don't often worry about themselves, but they worry about those they leave behind. So the carers payments in Scotland, we've invested in a run-on for that, so that can still be received once a loved one has passed away. And in terms of funeral support payments, that's been introduced in Scotland. There's some real concrete social contract activities to make lives better for people. And in my closing comments, Presiding Officer, I would simply say that I was also, as you were, Presiding Officer, at the Health Committee looking at the assisted dying legislation that you're taking forward in this place, Convener. And one thing everyone, irrespective of the perspective on assisted dying, agrees absolutely on is we all must do better for those approaching their end of lives. And together, irrespective of party, irrespective of Parliament, let's get together and do all we can.
Thank you, Mr Doris. I now call Alexander Stewart to be followed by Richard Leonard. Around 4 minutes. Mr Stewart.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I am pleased to be able to speak on this evening's debate, and I thank Paul Sweeney for bringing this important issue to the Chamber. As someone who was previously served as my party spokesperson for older people, and I am the current party spokesperson for the Shadow Cabinet Secretary for Social Security, I am delighted to be able to talk on this and congratulate Marie Curie on their work. Marie Curie have made important issues about this, and not just within the communities I represent, but all across Scotland. Their report comprises and research from both Marie Curie and Loughborough University, and it shines a light on the reality for thousands of people across Scotland who are spending their final months in poverty. The basic statistics are quite grim, Deputy Presiding Officer, with over 6,500 people living with a terminal illness die in the end of life, and they are in poverty at that stage. In 2021, over 56,000 people in Scotland died with a palliative care need, and the Scottish Government's own analysis showed that this figure could increase to 63,000 by 2040. No doubt all sides of this chamber can agree that no one at the end of their life should have to spend the final days worrying about financial issues. As with many health-related issues, the problem does not affect all parts of Scotland equally. The Government's own palliative care strategy, published last year, identified the levels of palliative care services vary significantly across different health boards. In areas, for example, like Glasgow and Dundee, it's 1 in 3. However, that is just not just an urban problem. In rural communities like I represent across Mid-Scotland Fife and in Clackmannanshire, in my own region, transport barriers can limit access to specialist healthcare. Energy costs can make it very expensive for mains-run powered medical devices to be plugged in at home. And for those living with a terminal illness, these pressures can be overwhelming, Deputy Presiding Officer. These pressures can also be challenging for unpaid carers, who remain the backbone of the social care system. Marie Curie rightly highlighted the local authorities have a role to play in tackling this issue, and they did identify at Manchester where the example of the discretionary council tax support are helping to support those with a terminal illness. Individual councils are well placed to decide how to deal with that extra support. Councils need the properly funded in order to provide that right level of support, and the onus is on the Scottish Government to have that discussion about how that could be dealt with and how that funding could take place. Presiding Officer, Marie Curie's report shows us that dying in poverty is far more widespread than we think. It is also difficult for us to solve the problem because we've seen that there's very little happened and reduced between surveys that came out in 2019 and then surveys that came out in 2024. The suffering is not inevitable, nor is it necessary. Access to all levels of government, there are solutions which can be put in place to tackle that. Deputy Presiding Officer, for all of those who have suffered with the end-of-life poverty in the past, and for those who might be suffering as they go into the future, I hope the Scottish Government can work constructively towards these solutions to help to secure people as they go forward. And in conclusion, I look forward to hearing from the Minister in his summing up as to what steps the Scottish Government is taking to achieve these goals, because we've said already nobody should be put into that position at the end of their life. And we as a government and we as a Parliament have a role to play in ensuring that we do all we can to help and secure suffering. And as I say, I commend Marie Curie and Paul Sweeney for what they've done so far on this. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Mr Stewart. And I call Richard Leonard to be followed by Eleanor Whittam. Around 4 minutes. Mr Leonard.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I thank Paul Sweeney for tabling this motion and so for the second year running leading this debate in Parliament. It has become a significant annual debate about an important annual report published by Marie Curie, this year once again produced in collaboration with the University of Loughborough. It is above all else about the way we live with terminal illness. And I say we because it could happen to any of us at any time. And I say we because we do not live as individuals, as consumers in a market. We live as citizens in a society, in a community, where we look out for each other. These preliminary findings also compel us to examine the world in which the Assisted Dying for Terminally Ill Adults Bill, which has been back before Parliament again just this week, is conducted. And I can't help thinking about the inverse care law, that those in the most need of support are oftentimes the ones least likely to receive it, that poverty and deprivation fuel conditions like clinical depression, that the suicide rate in our most deprived communities is 2.5 times that of our least deprived communities, and that, as the Association for Palliative Medicine has warned, palliative care is underfunded and unevenly available. Assisted dying, they conclude, risks deepening inequalities for vulnerable groups, which is why their members overwhelmingly oppose it, as do I. Replying to the debate on the 2024 report by Marie Curie last December, the Minister for Public Health and Women's Health told us that the Scottish Government is assessing the report and looking at where we can make changes. But the preliminary findings from this year's report are absolutely clear. That end-of-life poverty has stagnated and has not improved between 2019 and 2024, despite some policy efforts, and in some areas it has worsened. In the local authority areas that I am elected to represent in this Parliament, North Lanarkshire, South Lanarkshire, Falkirk, it has stagnated, with an average of 1 in 4 people of working age and 1 out of 6 people of pensionable age still dying in poverty. And as we know from the findings of previous years' reports that if you are black, Asian, from a minority ethnic background living in Scotland, you are twice as likely to die in poverty than if you are white. Last year in the debate, the Minister also proclaimed, I believe that we have to approach the issue from a very non-political perspective and work together to get the best results for the people of Scotland. Now, I'm happy to work together, but this is highly political. We have grotesque poverty in the midst of obscene wealth, because these findings are not just about poverty, they are about inequality. A sordid inequality of not just income, not just wealth, but a sordid inequality of power, which is class-based. And as long as we have an economy largely driven by the market and primarily run for the accumulation of wealth, as long as we have a society which is self-evidently riven with class divisions, we will never end poverty. Which is why we need not just welfare interventions as amelioration. What we need is a decisive and irreversible and a permanent shift in the balance of wealth and power, because these inequalities are structural. So we need radical action, fundamental change, economic as well as political change, a change in economic relations and so power relations, a new equilibrium. That's the only way we will change the material conditions and the quality of life and the fate of the people we are sent here to represent.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr Leonard. I now call Eleanor Whittam to be followed by Carl Moch in around 4 minutes. Ms Whittam.
Deputy Presiding Officer, let me start by expressing my thanks to Paul Sweeney for securing this important debate on a topic that is hugely important to all of us. And as Richard Leonard pointed out, I think that many of us spoke in this topic last year. And I think many of us that will be returning next year will be doing the same. In my constituency of Carrickmillock and Doon Valley, I see every day the quiet strength of communities who look after one another, especially when times are hard. But I also see something that should trouble each and every one of us in this chamber. People who are terminally ill, people at the very end of their lives, spending those last precious months and days in poverty. The preliminary findings from this invaluable research from Marie Curie and Loughborough University paint a devastating picture. Over 6,500 people in Scotland die in poverty each year, and more than 7,700 die in fuel poverty. And these are not just numbers on a page in a report. They are our neighbours, our parents, maybe even our children, our friends. We know them and we love them. In rural constituencies like mine, where we already face economic hardship, higher energy costs and an ageing population, that burden is even heavier. Families speak of loved ones putting on another jumper and currying under as many blankets as they can as they ration their heating so they can afford food. Or they tell us of children taking on caring responsibilities while their parents skip meals to make ends meet. Or, as the research tells us, they give up work to look after a dying loved one and end up having to resort to taking out costly loans just to survive. That's not dignity, that's not compassion, and that's not the Scotland that we want to be. And the research makes clear that 1 in 4 working-age people with a terminal illness dies in end-of-life poverty. Imagine that, after a lifetime of work, of paying into a system, people spend their final days worrying about bills instead of spending time with those they love. It's heartbreaking and it's unjust. For me, this is a social justice issue as well as a health issue. Deputy Presiding Officer, we must be bold to act. Marie Curie has called for people of working age living with a terminal illness to receive a guaranteed state pension level income, as my colleague Bob Dorrs pointed out. And I absolutely, fully support that call. No one should have to beg for financial security at the end of their life. Whilst we might not have all of the levers of social security, I wonder what the Scottish Government can do within their scope of powers, but also how they can apply pressure at UK level and perhaps work together to find a solution to that problem. But alongside financial justice, we must also look at how we care for people. For too long, our model has defaulted to hospital admission when what people truly want, and what research shows us, and what leads to better outcomes, is to be cared for in their own communities, surrounded by familiarity and love. And in my constituency, we see that alternative approach working in practice. Dalmellington Care Centre is a shining example of community-based palliative care, a place where compassion and professionalism meet. The centre, which is located and an area dealing with entrenched poverty, which hosts one of Scotland's deep-end GP practices, allows people to receive the care that they need close to home, supported by staff who know them, who understand the realities of rural life and who work hand in hand with the families and the communities and the community services. This is an innovative alternative model of care that should be replicated everywhere. And I was proud to see that the recent Care Inspector report recognised the outstanding work being done at Dalmellington, praising the commitment, the warmth, the dignity offered to every single resident. And that report shows what is possible when we invest in care that is local, integrated and rooted in community values. And the outreach and the follow-on support that's provided is second to none and ensures that all incomes are maximised. So as we debate how to tackle end-of-life poverty, let's also talk about the dignity in care. Let's ensure that every person in Scotland, whether they live in a city, tenement or a small Ayrshire village, has the right to a warm home, the right financial security and the right to a peaceful supported death. Deputy Presiding Officer, a society is judged not by its wealth, but by how it treats its most vulnerable. If we can find the compassion to act, to guarantee financial dignity, to expand community palliative care models like in Dalmellington, and to support families who give so much, then we will truly build a Scotland that cares in every sense of the word. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Whittam. I now call Carol Mochan to be followed by Jeremy Ball for around 4 minutes. Ms Mochan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I thank Paul Sweeney for again bringing this important debate to the Chamber. I've spoken in these debates in previous years, and it saddens me that once again we need to raise our voices to speak out for those dying in poverty. The report this year tells us that we have not moved the dial on this, not one bit, and so all our efforts in this Chamber must remain focused not on talk or reports or briefings, but on delivery of services and the redistribution of wealth. My colleague Richard Leonard put that so much better than me. This is about how we feel in society that we can redistribute wealth and power. Like so many things across the course of our life, the process of death is influenced by the poverty and the inequality experienced by so many. That 1 in 4 working-age people and 1 in 6 older people still die in end-of-life poverty should shame us all. I've said this in the Chamber before, but I feel compelled to say it again. Everyone deserves as pain-free and peaceful a death as possible, surrounded by those that love them, in a place that comforts them, and that the choice is theirs. Little interest is given to working people and the strain that often comes with working multiple jobs or living in forgotten communities. You ask, what makes me say that? Well, I grew up in a coalfield community. It's almost 40 years since the rapid closure of the mining industry began in former coalfield communities within South Scotland region, yet we are still seeing the consequences. Figures I found last year suggest that 44% of the working-age population in the Scottish coalfields is claiming some form of benefits, against a Scottish average of 23%. 40% of people in the Scottish coalfields have no qualification, against 27% for Scotland as a whole, and the mortality rate in the Scottish coalfields is 25% higher than the Scottish average. So that is why I feel that we do not give this enough priority. Poverty is the root of the injustice that permeates our society, and that injustice is often from the cradle to the grave. I simply cannot accept that, and this is really what drove me to speak again in today's debate. We have to do more to stop so many having so little, whilst the few have so much. The reality at the end of life is that the rich can often afford to stay at home and receive daily care directly in the places they have lived and prospered. At a time of their choosing, they can move to a place more suitable to support them. But for those that have suffered through a life of struggling to make ends meet, often no such options exist, and their life ends, as it proceeded, with a sense of powerlessness. Of course.
Paul Sweeney.
Thank my friend for giving way. She's making a really powerful point, and that, to mind that dying in the margins exhibition, one of the things that really struck me was the older woman who was dying, and she'd been so house proud, and she was photographing all of her rooms and how she kept her house really nice, but then the humiliation of everything slowly falling apart around her if she was struggling to care for herself, and then ending up not even being able to stay in her house at the end. I thought was really devastating to witness that in that exhibition. I think it speaks really powerful to the point you just made.
Carol Mochan.
Yeah, I was very fortunate to see that exhibition in Glasgow and then, of course, here in the Scottish Parliament. And it just brought home the reality for so many people who wish to stay in their own home, but they are struggling to do so. But I think we must not forget that they are struggling to do so throughout their life, and that injustice must be right. I find this to be the powerlessness to be the final injustice, and then one that we should be doing everything to limit. I'm going to say these words again because when I think about this, I think we all need to understand that everyone deserves as pain-free and peaceful a death as possible, surrounded by those that love them, in a place that comforts them, and that the choice is there, never dictated by what can be afforded. I simply cannot accept that someone dying cannot get the care and comfort that they deserve in a time of need like the end of life. Surely we must be looking to find solutions to providing all the care and comfort necessary. And I close on that point, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Mochan. And now we can now come to the final speaker in the open debate, Jeremy Balfour. Around 4 minutes, please. Point of order, Bob Doris.
I apologise to my colleagues for doing a point of order, but I did inadvertently mislead Parliament earlier on during my contribution, where I mentioned the £2.3 billion spent on those in the last year of their lives that Marie Curie had estimated, and the vast majority of that is the acute health service. I had said that £500 million was spent on social security payments. It's not £500 million. If it was thus, that would be fantastic. It's £500,000. I think that's very important to put in the record, President Officer, but apologies for cutting into the flow of the debate, which has been superb so far.
Thank you, Mr Doris. Not a point of order, but it is now on the record. I now call Jeremy Balfour again. Around 4 minutes, Mr Balfour.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I, like others, thank Paul Sweeney for bringing this debate forward this evening. Just over 2 years ago, my father died of a terminal illness. It was a really hard time for my mother and for us as a family. But we were fortunate. My father was in his own home, well off, able to have the care that he required. And so I find it almost impossible to imagine to go through such circumstances where there is financial poverty in that family as well. It's been said that the moral test of any society is how it treats those who are in the dawn of life, our children, those who are in the twilight of life, the elderly, and those who are in the shadows of life, people who live with disability or long-term illness. Yet today we have heard a sobering truth, that in Scotland each year over 6,500 people living with terminal illness die in poverty. That's not simply a number. That is mothers, fathers, grandparents, neighbours, friends, and sadly sometimes children, whose final months are overshadowed not only by illness, but by financial hardship and anxiety. Instead of dignity, too many experience cold homes, empty cupboards and mounting bills. For those facing the end of life, every moment should matter, yet poverty steals away the precious time, replacing it with fear, exhaustion and indignity. Now, I fully accept that both the UK and the Scottish Government are trying to deal with these issues. There are tireless campaigns on end-of-life poverty, but as we've heard from others, the dial is not moving. In some of our communities here in Edinburgh and Lothian, it has even got worse. And that's a shame, because it is not inevitable. Poverty at the end of life is a policy failure, not a personal one. Every person, no matter of their circumstances, has equal dignity, worth and purpose. Our duty as parliamentarians is to care for one another, especially the most vulnerable. Organisations like Marie Curie have shown there is a better way. Their research with Loughborough University has highlighted both the scale of the problem, but as Mr Dawes pointed out, practical steps that can be taken, for example, the support of Scottish Government, Social Security Scotland, local authorities to make sure that the maximisation and uptake of disability benefits through the values-first approach that removes any stigma for taking benefit. This is not simply numbers or budgets. It actually defines what type of country we are and what type of nation we want to be. I want to live, I'm sure all of us want to live, in a Scotland that values life not by its productivity alone, but by its inherent worth. Because I am human, I have inherent worth. When someone reaches the end of their life, our collective responsibility is clear: to deliver dignity and care without the burden of bureaucracy or delay. That's why I'm so pleased that we in this Parliament were the first within the UK to bring forward the 6-month rule for social security benefits, and that has made a big difference. I want to thank briefly the work of Marie Curie and St Columba's Hospice, both here in the city. So, like others, I call this chamber to unite behind a simple moral goal: that no one in Scotland should die in poverty. The true measure of a compassionate society is found in how it treats those with the least, especially when they have the least time left. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Balfour. And I now invite Tom Arthur to respond to the debate. Minister, around 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I begin by thanking Paul Sweeney for bringing this very important debate to Parliament and putting on my record, and I know I'm joining others in doing so, and expressing my appreciation and gratitude to Marie Curie for the incredible work that they do day in and day out to support people who are terminally ill, as well as their families and loved ones. This report highlights, and as has been noted, unfortunately not for the first time, some of the real financial challenges facing people at the end of their life. And it cannot be right that at this most difficult of times, families also have to face this additional pressure. I would also like to acknowledge here the work of Barnardo's, Age Scotland and the Poverty and Inequality Commission, who have also provided helpful information and insights into these issues. I'd also like to thank members across the chamber for their contributions to Bob Doris, Nillian Whittam, Carol Mock and Alexander Stewart, and the contribution as well from Paul Sweeney, and also the contributions from Richard Leonard and, as we've just heard, from Jeremy Balfour. And I thought there was a particular link between Mr Balfour and Mr Leonard's contributions, because Mr Balfour spoke about the inherent dignity and value of life and the true measure of what a successful society should be judged by. And I felt that was very much at the heart of Mr Leonard's contribution as well, where he spoke powerfully, as did Carol Mochan, about the structural inequalities and these wider economic determinants that unfortunately still too often characterise people's experience, not just of their life and their economic circumstances and social circumstances, but their experience of end of life. And I think where we, of course, consider what specific further interventions we can make and what further support we can provide, I think it is important that we do not lose sight of that more profound question. And I think it is one that is becoming more and more pertinent and inescapable. There were one or two specific points that were raised in the debate, and I want to respond to the point that Mr Sweeney raised and indeed Mr Stewart, which was regards to what is happening in Manchester. Now, the advice that I have received is that that has been undertaken in Manchester under provisions of Section 13A of the Local Government Finance Act 1992. My understanding is that the territorial applications of these provisions extends to England only, and as such we do not have that discretion within the Act to do so in Scotland. However, as part of the Government's wider work looking at council tax reform, I wish to reassure the member and the wider chamber that this is something we will give consideration to, because I do think it is a very important point. Turning more broadly, Presiding Officer, to the work of the Government, we continue to take steps, important steps, to address the challenges that have been highlighted within the report. And we do so within the context of the powers that we have under the devolution settlement and the constraints of the budgets that we operate in. The social security system in Scotland quite rightly takes a different approach, fast-tracking disability assistance applications from terminally ill people to ensure they automatically receive the highest rates of disability assistance they are entitled to. And importantly, there are no time limits on the definition of terminal illness, and this decision is rightly made by clinicians. And this person-centred definition of terminal illness applies to all our disability assistances, child disability payment, adult disability payment and pension aid disability payment. The Scottish Government, within the constraints of the powers and budgets, also are committed to mitigating winter heating costs and supporting people to access all support available to them. This coming winter, 25-26, we will provide an estimated £28.3 million for our winter heating payment, £11.4 million for our child winter heating payment and £157 million for our pension winter age heating payment. These benefits provide guaranteed support to people who have an identified need for additional heat over the winter months, including low-income households, families with disabled children and young people and pensioners. The Government wholeheartedly agrees with the report recommendation that the UK Government should introduce a social tariff, something Mr Doris touched on in his remarks. A social tariff mechanism is very clearly, in the view of the Government, the best way to ensure that energy consumers are protected against high bills, or higher bills rather. And we have called on the previous UK Government to introduce one, partly to ensure people with terminal illnesses whose bills can be thousands of pounds higher than the average household don't have to make that horrendous choice between powering vital medical equipment, heating their homes or buying food. We're also taking meaningful steps to address racial inequality, something that has been touched on by members in reference to the report, as it does remain an unwelcome reality that communities across Scotland experience health, quality of life and even life expectancy differently depending on their circumstance. We are committed to addressing the significant and persistent health inequalities experienced by minority ethnic communities in Scotland. These inequalities have, unfortunately, widened in recent years due to the impacts of austerity, the economic consequences of Brexit, COVID and the subsequent cost of living crisis. In his September 2024 anti-racism statement, the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care identified racism as a key driver of these health inequalities and a significant public health challenge. This anti-racism statement sets the expectation that anti-racism will be embedded across the health and care system. In order to tackle these socio-economic inequalities that are the root of health inequalities, we are complementing our health efforts with wide-ranging cross-government action. Together with COSLA, on the 17th of June of this year, we published a Population Health Framework, our refreshed 10-year cross-government and cross-sector approach to population health, focused on prevention. The framework sets a clear, evidence-based aim to galvanise the whole system to action, to improve Scottish life expectancy while reducing the life expectancy gap between the most deprived 20% of local areas and the national average by 2035. We want everyone in Scotland, regardless of age, race, diagnosis or location, to have access to timely, high-quality and person-centred palliative care. Our 5-year palliative care strategy includes measures to better integrate specialist palliative care into hospital and community services, improve public information about living with life-shortening conditions too. And this strategy will help to ensure that people of all ages with life-shortening conditions, their families and carers, should receive the right care and support in the right place at the right time and from the right people. These are just some of the steps that the Scottish Government is undertaking to prevent people from dying in end-of-life poverty. Can I again thank Mr Sweeney for bringing forward this debate, to all members for their contributions, and to Marie Curie both for this report and for the brilliant and invaluable work that they undertake day in, day out.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes the debate, and I close this meeting of Parliament.